All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our third Ohio Protects Pollinator segment in this series. So I just want to, say that we're super excited to be connecting with you through these webinars. It might be a little bit counterintuitive, because we're trying to encourage you to get outside, but really what we want to do is just give you ideas of how you can continue exploring your environment on your own at home and answer any questions that you might have while you're out there exploring. That's what we're here for. So thanks for joining us. If you're wondering what the buzz about bees is, well, you've come to the right place. We will talk about that today. I'm Melissa Yapel, and I will be moderating today and helping keep track of the questions that are asked, and I will ask those questions later on to our presenters. So with me, I have Rochelle Gatto, and Rochelle's also going to help me with the Q&A. And you can see that was Rochelle that waved right there. But Rochelle is with us from Wingfoot State Park. She's the naturalist up at Wingfoot in Northeast Ohio. And I have John Hickenbottom from Salt Fork State Park and Mandy Wolski. You may remember Mandy if you've joined any of our other webinars. Mandy is from Cowan Lake State Park. So before we get started, I just want to point you to the Q&A box. You'll see a little question mark that has Q&A. And so I once again encourage you to utilize that throughout to ask questions. I'm also going to put a link in there right at the beginning here that will take you to a form where you can answer a couple of questions we have for you. The first one is how do bees communicate? So please go to the form and answer that question, and then John will let you know later on in the program what the answer is. And then we also want to hear, what do you want to hear from us for the next webinar series? So next week is going to be our last one of Ohio Protects Pollinators, and then we'll have something new for you. So let us know what you want to see. With that, though, I'm going to send it over to John, and we will get started.
All right. Hi, everyone. First off, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Second, I'm kind of covering the technical aspects of honeybee keeping and why honeybees are important and what makes them so fascinating. One of the most interesting things about keeping bees is one thing that I'm finding, because I am by no means an expert on keeping bees, and one thing that I am finding is that there are very few experts on keeping bees. There are many ways to do it, and it's sort of a very long-term learning experience. Bees are very fascinating because they have a really complex social structure. They've got really interesting behavior. They, generally speaking, they're really the only animal that solely produces something that we can consume, and that's without there are a few other things, but bees, you think about it, they make honey, they make beeswax, they make things that are really they're really important to our civilization as it is now. They pollinate lots of things, and we'll get to that here in a second, but they're really amazing animals. Now I keep looking backwards because I'm sitting very close to a beehive right now, and they're kind of freshly installed bees. So I'm just trying to keep an eye on them. And if you see me like flick my ear or anything like that, it's because I think something's crawling on me. So these particular bees, again, I'm not an expert. I'm a hobbyist, and I was not going to do it this year. And luckily enough, I got the opportunity to capture a feral swarm. And a feral swarm is, so domestic bees, western bees, have been here since somewhere in the 1700s they came to the New World and became like frequently people were shipping them over from Europe. So they've been here long enough to be considered naturalized. So there are wild populations of honeybees out there living in hollow trees and things like that. And bees will swarm once a hive gets so large. Once a colony gets so large, they will swarm and break off basically a core of that that colony will break off and establish a new colony, leaving a new queen behind, or taking a new queen with them. And that's probably the case with these. I am guessing these were wild bees that broke off from another colony, a wild colony, because when I installed them last week, they began to actually hang comb from the roof rather than using any of the frames that were supplied. So I'm guessing that's much more what they would do in a natural setting. Now, I have kind of your typical bee box behind me. I don't know how well you can see it. That's sort of the typical. You can pick these up at Rural King. You can pick them up online. Kind of your typical bee box. There also is another one that's pretty popular called a top bar hive that I've used in the past. That's actually what I started using, and they're nice. They kind of they try to mimic the inside of a hollow tree or something like that. They don't have frames. When I say a frame, I'm actually talking about this. This is an old frame. This is a frame that has a sheet of pre-pressed wax in it, and if you look at the wax, there's actually the foundation for a comb in it, so they can actually build cells off of that foundation. Now a top bar hive doesn't have this. It simply has this top bar, and it's suspended from the inside of the box, and they build sort of U-shaped semicircular combs off of that. Top bar hives do not produce as much honey because it's a little harder to regulate what the queen's doing inside of a top bar hive. Well, these were kind of developed specifically for honey production, and this is what we're talking about today with this box behind me is this sort of setup. Now most of these are pre-made, and I've bought them, but you can actually make them at home, and I've done it. You can order these wax sheets that get wired into the frame. This wax is pretty important. It really kind of kickstarts their foundation building for cells, for the little cells that they're going to store honey in and keep brood in. So inside of a beehive like this, there are cells that are specifically for honey, and there are cells that are specifically for larval bees, for brood, where the queen lays eggs. And I'm kind of going to get into that here in a moment. But beekeeping is not a new thing. It's become much more important in the last few years because of our dwindling honeybee populations, with colony collapse and different things like that. Lots of different factors contribute to the dwindling honeybee populations. So, it's been very, very public in recent years. Actually, within the last 10 years, lots of places, even very urban places, have started allowing backyard beekeepers just to try to build more of a honeybee population. But beekeeping, there is evidence that beekeeping has been around at least 10,000 years. At least honey collection has been around at least 10,000 years. There's pottery vessels that are believed to have been beehives, pottery beehives in northern Africa up to 9,000 years ago. And there's Egyptian art 5,000 to 4,500 years ago showing people keeping bees. So it's not a new thing. It's been around for a really long time. The domestication of the honeybee that we know has been around for a really long time. It's been a really long process. Now I mentioned I captured a swarm of bees. You can order bees online and have them shipped to you, or you can go pick them up and install them on your own. But they're kind of three types of domestic bees that are usually used in North America. Now there's up to, I think there's 44 different subspecies of honeybee worldwide, but there are three types that are kind of commercially used. There are Italian, which are probably by far the most common, and I believe these ones are Italian bees. They're kind of, if you ask someone to draw you a generic picture of a honeybee, they would draw an Italian bee, if that makes sense. They're the fuzzy, dark yellow and banded, black banded bees. So then there are, I can never pronounce this one right, Carnolian bees, which are from the Alps. Those were hybridized with Italian bees, and they ultimately kind of became the Russian bee, which is the third type, was the Russian honeybee. They all have different attributes. Some of them survive winters better. Some of them are less aggressive. Some of them have a higher yield of honey. And of course, there's like the Africanized bee, which we don't have a problem with in Ohio and the Northeast, but in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, those Africanized honeybees are a major problem because they're hyper aggressive. Hey,
John, we have a question that I thought I might ask you. Okay. Somebody asked, is keeping hives in a backyard dangerous?
Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose if you're allergic, or your neighbor's allergic, it can pose a safety risk. But overall, honeybees are not terribly aggressive. One of the things, bees kind of get a bad reputation because when you think about a bee sting, a lot of times folks are getting stung by Yellowjackets, which are actually a type of wasp, and they're really aggressive. They live in holes in the ground. They're like the ground hornets that you might mow over while you're mowing your yard. That's a little different than a bee sting. Overall, most domestic honeybees are not terribly aggressive. I guess it's maybe as dangerous as keeping, keeping really any sort of livestock. As long as it's handled properly, it's not a terrible safety risk. As long as you handle it properly, whether it's dogs or horses or honeybees, as long as you handle it properly, they're not terribly aggressive. I will say a few things that I try to do. I try to keep them out of like shared space, the space that I share with my neighbor. I don't keep them in areas like that. I try to keep them out of heavily trafficked areas, because all of those things are things that you have to consider. Bees communicate using all 5 senses, and one of their senses is an alarm, or one of their ways of communicating is an alarm pheromone. If a bee gets killed, it will send out a pheromone to the guard bees at the hive. So, if you've got an area where bees are frequently getting killed, where you're frequently stepping on them, it can often make the hive a little more aggressive because they're constantly getting that alarm that there's something wrong, that a bee's injured and they need to respond to it. So I try to keep it out of high traffic areas. I try to keep it out of areas that I'm going to mow right next to, So I hope that answers the question. They're not inherently dangerous. And for most people, if you're not allergic, a bee sting, is not nearly as bad as, say, a wasp sting or a hornet sting or anything like that. One of the major differences between things like wasps and hornets and honeybees is that wasps can sting multiple times. They have a nice smooth stinger like a sewing needle. Bees have a little barb on their stinger, and they're kind of a one-shot deal. If you get stung by a honeybee, it actually disembowels itself flying away from you. It pulls, that stinger gets left in your skin, and it pulls itself. It pulls its own guts out as it flies away, and it dies. So they can sting one time, If you think about like a paper wasp or a hornet or a yellow jacket, you can get stung multiple times by the same individual because that stinger is nice and it's basically just a hypodermic needle. So a lot of times those are much worse. Just before we started, I got to see a paper wasp try to get into the beehive and rob some of the honey from the beehive. And the bees actually, about 4 bees kind of wrestled it to the ground and killed it. So that's those that are those guard bees that I was talking about. Those are those bees that are kind of patrolling the entrance of the hive and making sure everything's safe. So some of the technical things is that are we good with questions? I guess I can't see our question feed right at the moment.
We're good.
Oh, okay, cool. Some of the technical things. This beehive behind me, I actually have it set up for winter right now. I will probably change it this week because the weather's kind of shifting. So it's got this thick peaked roof. The peaked roof is so snow slides off of it in the winter. And it's got a really thick wooden base. You have to take temperature inside the hive into consideration. Bees can kind of keep their hive climate controlled. They can actually control ventilation and moisture content within the hive, and it's very fascinating the way they do that. But there are some things, if they're in direct sunlight like mine, it's kind of out in the middle of my yard, you have to kind of consider temperature and things like that. So there's actually a summer base that I can attach to the bottom, which has a screen. It's got this sort of hardware cloth mesh bottom, so it's the same format as the current base, except the current base has an all wood solid bottom. This allows for ventilation, but right now, because it's still cold at night, I've got a winter base on there. Now if I can do that, if I can keep the temperature proper within the hive, the bees will handle everything else. If the moisture content is too high, if there's too much dampness in the hive, they will actually line up and fan their wings and cause a draft to cool the hive or and to evaporate some of that moisture out of there. So really fascinating. They know how to do that. And now within this hive, there are 3 types of bees. There are worker bees, which are non-reproducing females. They're females that collect honey. They feed the queen. They feed the drone. They collect pollen. They patrol the entrance of the hive. They clean out. Some of them are on body detail for any dead bees. They'll drag dead bees out, which is pretty convenient. You can kind of tell if something is wrong with your hive, because if bees start piling up right at the entrance, you don't even have to get in to know that bees are dying off. Because if you have an unusual amount of bees piling up right at the entrance of your hive, you kind of know something's amiss. And then there's the queen, and the queen is there's one queen in a hive that kind of runs the show, and she's the only one that's reproducing. And then the drone is actually the male bees. Now, male bees, they're completely expendable as far as that goes. They have a pretty short lifespan, and they have one purpose in the world, and that's to find and impregnate queens. That's their only purpose. They are basically, what I've always told people is, a drone bee is basically it's basically walking genetic material. That's its only job, is to find to find a new queen and reproduce with them. So drones, as opposed to workers, which have multiple jobs, they take care of the queen, they take care of the young, they store honey, they collect pollen, they clean up the hive, they control the temperature in the hive. Drones basically sit there and they eat and they eat, and then they fly out and they find a new queen out on her first flight, and that's their only job, is to find and impregnate queens. Now, queens are actually made in a very fascinating way. Within a hive, when a queen lays an egg, If that queen is too old or the hive's too large, there's too many bees in the hive, there can be there's signals within the hive that say they need to have a new queen. Sometimes if the new queen is too old and she's not laying enough eggs, she's not doing the best, the hive will kind of shift and create a new queen. And the way they do that is they feed the queen, the larval queen, they feed them exclusively a substance called royal jelly. And royal jelly is a special type of honey, a special type of secretion from the bees that all bees are started out on. All of the larval bees are started out on royal jelly, but most of them get switched over to the normal bee food, normal honey, and other secretions like that. And the queens are fed exclusively royal jelly. And a queen is much larger than the rest of the bees. You can usually pick them out. I haven't physically seen the queen in this hive yet. I've got a vague notion of where she's at because of how the bees are behaving, but I haven't seen her. But they're larger. They've got a larger abdomen, and they're formed in these kind of long, pipe-shaped cells called queen cells, and when they emerge, a virgin queen, a brand new queen, will actually go out on basically a breeding flight, where like 30 or so feet up in the air, they will encounter a drone and mate. And when the drone mates with the queen, he actually dies almost immediately after. When a drone mates with the queen, he actually leaves his reproductive organs in place and flies off, and later dies. So it's very interesting. Like I said, one of the things that make honeybees so fascinating is their social structure, and the drone queen worker dynamic within the hive is very fascinating. So a typical worker bee can live between 120 and 150 days, and which is nice because if you think about it, 150 days will get you through the winter. So there will be winter workers all winter long. But a drone basically is a seasonal presence in the hive. They're through the warmer seasons, and in the fall when things start cooling off, the worker bees actually drive the drones out and won't let them back in. They stop feeding them, and they'll actually stand guard and not let the drones back in, and the drones all die off in the winter. Now a queen, while the workers can live, a little under half of a year, I guess the queen can last 3 or 4 years in a colony. So it's a very fascinating social structure. Now, as far as getting started in beekeeping, there are a lot of things to consider. First of all, are you in a place where it's allowed? There are some places that do have ordinances against keeping bees, just like places that have ordinances against keeping chickens. But there's also, bees are kind of prop heavy. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with beekeeping, and it's really hard to substitute for the real thing, and it's kind of unsafe. You don't want to, I've seen videos of folks like getting into beehives wearing trash bags as a bee suit. You don't really want to do that, so you have to consider, like, if you can support a beehive. But they also take some care. We're going to, when I get into the beehive toward the end and actually show you a frame, I will show you how to feed the bees. And I've got sugar water here that I've got to feed this hive because, it's been pretty cold. They're not moving around a lot, so they're not going out and collecting nectar and really bringing anything back to the hive at this point. They've only been in there about a week. So I've got to supplement that with sugar water to kind of keep them happy and healthy, which requires me going into the hive. But there's also, there's so much to consider with with bees. I've got the whole suit here, which you'll get the pleasure of seeing me suited up here in a little bit. But they can be really complicated sometimes as far as what you're doing and what you're doing wrong. And when I mention that I'm not an expert beekeeper, I'm finding out that there is no such thing as an expert beekeeper, that you can talk to two different beekeepers and get two completely different methods of doing things, and they both might be right, even if they're contradictory. So one of the best resources that I have found has been beekeeping manuals, and almost any honey supply or beekeeping supply house has their own honey or honeybee manual that you can get. And sometimes if you order, a pound of bee or 3 pounds of bees, which they come in this box called a nuke, and it's 3 pounds of bees. When you order those, a lot of times you can ask for that manual. I have several from several different apiaries, and they're all good, and they all have different information in them. So it's pretty fascinating. Now, honeybees pollinate a variety of crops, fruit trees, and many different things. But it tends to be, because honeybees are sort of in the public spotlight, people think that they pollinate just everything. Like we can thank honeybees for pollinating everything, but that's not always the case. I mean, a honeybee actually cannot pollinate a tomato plant. Tomatoes require a specific type of pollination called buzz pollination, where the insect that's pollinating them actually buzzes inside there and shakes all of the pollen off the anther of the plant and pollinates that plant. And bees don't do that. So there are lots of other things that also pollinate plants, but honeybees pollinate a ton of different things, and it's really important to the diversity of our whole biome here. Like, really, it's really important. So if you're getting the honeybees for the purposes of like pollinating crops and things like that, that's great. You can kind of set up your hive. If you're not harvesting honey, you can just maintain it and set up multiple hives. If a swarm splits, you can have boxes available. But if you're in it, I think most people like to keep bees for the honey. One of the things that I have found that most honey production uses something called a queen excluder, and the queen excluder is this one's actually a 2-part queen excluder. The queen excluder allows for you to isolate the queen in a box, which means she can only lay eggs in certain cells. She can only lay eggs in one box. We call that a brood box. I don't know if you folks can see on top here, I've got like a narrow box. That's the box that I am using as a brood box right now. There's sort of a shallow box on top. That means that if I put this queen excluder in there, all of the cells below that the queen can't access will get filled with honey. The workers will fill that space with honey. One thing that bees are really good at, if there is empty space, they will fill it. So I mentioned the sugar water. Bees sometimes, depending on your area and depending on what's in bloom, and depending on how healthy the hive is, bees will sometimes need supplements. The sugar water is supplemental. There's also, you can get pollen cake, this is a pollen feeder to feed your bees. Can everybody hear me all right? My screen kind of froze up. I apologize. Am I still on? All right. All right, thank you. Sorry, my screen just kind of froze up. Let's see. All right. So these honeybees right now are coming and going pretty quickly. they've heated up. It's a nice warm day out, so they've warmed up. Bees really they really depend on temperature as far as how active they are. But you can also, if you're keeping honeybees, you can actually plant certain plants in your yard to help your hives out. I have a whole sort of crop of lilies growing right now. I know my bees like a few varieties of lilies that I have growing. I have 2 apple trees in my yard that they also very much enjoy. And I know a beekeeper that exclusively grows tobacco for his bees. They really like the flower that the tobacco plant produces, and so do hummingbirds. So it's he's got kind of a win-win. He has a ton of hummingbirds in his yard and honeybees. So there are many things you can do. You can feed them to supplement them, and you can also grow certain plants in your yard to help supplement your colony. Let's see. So, do they have any? So there's a question that came up on the Q&A. Do they have accents as well? Is that?
Yeah, I was going to ask that a little later on because I didn't want to interrupt you, but
that one I'm not.
I think they're asking if they communicate differently in different regions.
Oh, that one I don't know. Mandy, Rochelle, you guys have I'm not entirely sure about that. Whether there's a bee dialect. I believe that the different varieties of bee communicate slightly differently. But it's also, if I were to take a queen, because of the way their social structure is, if I were to take a queen from one hive and just drop her in another hive, she would not be welcome. They wouldn't immediately take to that queen. She's not communicating right. She's not. My microphone is muted.
I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, it just told me that my microphone was muted. So bees are not necessarily, they can't, if you take one bee from another hive and drop it into this hive here, they're not going to immediately get to work. They won't be welcome. They will, you can re-queen a hive by taking a new queen, and if you order a queen or capture a queen, but if you order a queen, they will come in a little cage like this, and it's got this little hook on it that you would actually hang from a frame, and that lets the whole hive get used to this queen's pheromones and get used to the way she communicates. And this little cage will be there in one little cell. There's going to be the queen, and then there's going to be a sugar cake in this portion right here that the queen will actually eat. And eventually the workers will bore through, once they get used to this queen and kind of start speaking her language, they'll bore through and release the queen. But if I were to just take the queen out and drop her in, they would not welcome her. If 2 queens are hatched at the same time in a hive, they'll kind of battle it out until there's only one left. So I'm not sure about bees having accents, but I know that they do communicate differently. And bees use all 5 senses. They use smell, sight, taste, vibrations, everything to communicate and to feel the world around them within the hive. So I hope that kind of answers your question. All right.
Yeah. So. Hey, John, I'm going to switch this over to Mandy if you want to get ready for the second part.
Sounds great.
And, all right, here's Mandy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. Again, mine is telling me that I am muted at the top, just like John's was. So hopefully this is working. So welcome back. I'm Andy from Cowan Lake, and I wanted to talk to you about some bees that John was talking about, our honeybees specifically. But here in Ohio, we have hundreds of different kinds of bees, and where the honeybees like to live together in a community, many of our bees here in Ohio are solitary. And what that means is that they don't live like we do in homes with kids and adults and maybe grandparents come and uncles and aunts. They live just by themselves. So our native bees in the Megachilidae, I'm probably saying that wrong, but that is a family of bees that has many different species in it that live in hollowed out pieces of wood or maybe old parts of trees. They'll even take over the hollowed out tunnels of beetles. So they don't like to do the work themselves. So we do know of a bee that most of us know, which is the large Carpenter Bee that eats our soffits on our house or tears apart our deck. These bees are a little different. They can't actually chew up that wood and get rid of it to make their own. So they have to steal from others. Some of these bees, they're really neat. They use different materials for nesting. We have some that are known as mason bees, and they make kind of a mortar, just like a mason that does brickwork. They use mud to make different sections inside their nest. We also have something called a leafcutter bee, and a leafcutter bee is just what it says it does. They will cut apart a leaf, and I have a great photo I want to show you guys out of one of my bee books. So they use the pieces of the leaf, and they make a little cell using these leaf pieces to make a little home for their eggs. So another one we have is called a wool carder. Now these wool carders, they're pretty easy for us to see because a lot of us think they look like wasps. And I want to give you an idea of what I mean. Most of them are going to have these black and white striped abdomens, and those kind of look like a wasp, something that screams danger. But these, just like John said about the honeybees, these are very nice bees. They're gentle, they're not aggressive, and most of the time if you get stung by a bee in this family, it was probably an accident. Say one of them lands on your arm and you close your arm, that's normally how you get hurt by these, or stepping on them as they're looking for nectar and pollen and flowers. So how do we help these bees? John was talking about having this big house and getting these honeybees and having a queen delivered, but there's so much easier ways to help if you don't want to go through all of that. So you can help bees in your yard very easily by just leaving a stick pile. You could also leave out some logs, like make a log pile. You can, if you have a rock wall that you keep cleaned out and you spray it often, you can leave that messy and bees will find a way to tunnel down in there and make their nests. Dead trees help. Some of our bees like to live in between the bark on dead trees. Even leaving leaf litter during the fall helps some of these bees. Many of our bees in Ohio are ground nesters, and that means they dig tunnels into the ground or steal others' tunnels. And so leaving that leaf litter helps them stay hidden during the winter. One thing that I do like to do in my yard is limit the use of pesticides. Now, sometimes we have things like termites and we just can't help it. We have to use pesticides, but I want to give you a few tips. When you're using those pesticides, there's directions on the back of the box, and it's always a good idea to follow those as best as you can. And limiting their use means only using them if you absolutely have to. You can also, we've talked in the last 2 episodes about nectar plants because we all love our native species. Use our nectar plants, give them something that they can eat and collect pollen from to feed their babies. But one of the things I want to talk to you about today is how to help these bees that need these pre-made holes. Yes, there are plenty of places for them to find out in the wild, but making a mason bee house, these things have become pretty popular. You can now buy mason bee houses at places like Walmart, and even the Dollar Tree in my area is selling them. So basically a mason bee house is a place for them to live safely. So here I have a lot of different examples of how to do that, and I'll pull some of these out so you can see. We have some mason bee, or some of these bees are really, really tiny. So they will live in holes that are super small. And some of them want to have holes that are just a little bit bigger. And then we even have some species that prefer large holes like this. So doing a bunch of different sized holes, even in the same block of wood, can help bring in multiple species to you. We do have some species that prefer to nest in dead twigs. So some of these all came off of my milkweed plants from last year. The stem of the milkweed is hollow. So as it dries out, it makes these nice hard twigs here. And I've just bundled them together for an option for them to hide in. Some other plants that you may have in your yard are bee balm. Sunflower stalks have hollow stems, blackberry stems, and even most of our aster species are going to have hollow stems. So what I've done, and wives, if you're listening and the power tools belong to your husband, definitely ask before you just go out to the garage and grab them. And kids, if you're listening, you don't want to grab the power tools without help. So I took some really old wood and I cut it to make this box. It was pretty simple. It doesn't really matter what size the box is, how big you make it, but you want it to be at least 6 inches in depth. So the bigger bees need longer holes. The next thing I did was I found some old wood pieces. So this was just a block of wood, and I cut it into smaller pieces that would fit inside my new bee house. And then I used a drill with different size bits. Now, Alyssa's going to share something in our comments on how to make these yourself. We have a couple different, there are all kinds of them out there on the internet, but we did find one from our Ohio State University Extension Office that has a pretty good layout and example of all the different ways you can help your bees, and making a mason bee house is in that document. So when you're doing this, the most important thing you can do for these bees is keep this house clean. So it's very easy. Don't need a lot of maid service for these guys. It's a once a year kind of a thing. A couple different ways. You can take these blocks out in November, put them in a nice safe place so that those bees can overwinter in their little holes, and then they'll come out in spring. Or you, and then once those bees come out in spring, you would sterilize these with a bleach solution, maybe a tiny little bottle brush to get down in these holes. There's also the option, since this was just old wood that was not going to be used for anything, and this was an old a crabapple tree in our yard. These are easy and cost effective to replace, especially if you have a lot of hollow stemmed plants. So at the end of spring and summer, when there are no bees left in here, then you can just toss these and start all over each year. Alyssa will share, there is a lot of details that I probably missed on that, so Alyssa will share that. The other important thing besides cleanliness is where you're going to put this. So these bees like to be warm. They don't like shade. So you want this to be put up on a south or southeast facing part of your property, and you want them in full sun. And they want to be about 4 to 6 feet off the ground. And keeping them in the sun also helps prevent some of our predators, like spiders, who like cold, dark places. And Alyssa, if I don't have any questions about these bee houses, I know John is dying to show us his getup.
Yeah, one more thing, Mandy. How many species of bees are there in Ohio? Do you know?
Over 400. In North America alone, there are over 5,000 native bee species, and these cavity nesters make up about 30% of those. So in Ohio, oh my goodness, I couldn't even begin to imagine how many of those 5,000 species are here, but I do believe it's over 400. I could be getting that confused with butterflies, though. So I can look that up and get back to you. I got my book right in front of me.
Okay. All right. Well, I will send it to John. John, you just got to take yourself off mute, and then you're ready to go. If you can in your beekeeping suit.
Alyssa, there's actually thousands of species of bee and wasp in Ohio combined.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I've got kind of a standard beekeeping outfit here. This one, I've got a beekeeping hat, this pith helmet with a net around it. This is not my favorite style of net because parts of it actually touch my face, and if a bee gets on there and decides to sting me, it can sting, and it's kind of hard to keep it flared out from my face. But this suit accommodates a hood that's sort of a rigid nylon hood that looks a lot more like a spacesuit. I just no longer have the rigid nylon hood. Some mice got in the tote that I was storing it in, 8 holes through the hood. So I'm kind of left with this. But the key to these beekeeping suits, the whole purpose of them, they're kind of a heavy duck material, and it really prevents you from getting stung. And they're pretty secure. They come with these elbow-length leather gloves, and I like to use just elastic hair ties. I'm fortunate; I've got 2 daughters, so I've got a lot of elastic hair ties laying around my house. I like to seal off any holes with these. I put them around my ankles before I put my boots on, and I kind of put them above my elbow just to make sure that the bees can't get anywhere. And then I tuck the net down into the collar of the suit. One thing that I wanted to mention is placement of the hive. I also place the hive so the entrance is facing east and it gets really good morning sun. That's kind of how the honeybees prefer it, and it really allows them to maximize their traffic in and out of the hive if they get that good morning sun to warm up first thing in the day. So getting into a beehive can be a little complicated, especially a new beehive like this. These are freshly installed bees. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is called a smoker, a bee smoker, and it's kind of a classic beekeeping tool. You see this basically in any sort of media that talks about keeping honeybees. You usually see a guy with a smoker smoking the beehive. Now, the smoke doesn't actually sedate the bees. The smoke triggers an alarm response. They think it's a fire, and it kind of does 2 things. It masks the guard pheromones, the alarm pheromones that I was talking about earlier. It masks that so they don't get agitated, but it also triggers that response that they think there's a fire and they might have to abandon ship, and they will gorge themselves on honey or sugar, and they will calm down. I'm going to use this maybe a little bit, but because this is a new hive and there's not a huge honey supply, I'm not going to smoke them too much. I'm not going to just pump it full of smoke. What I'm going to use instead is a spray bottle full of sugar water. Now the sugar water that I'm using is roughly a 1-to-1 mixture. I mix it a little lighter than 1-to-1. So it's kind of a simple syrup. I heat the water up, dissolve the sugar in it. It keeps it a little longer that way. There are lots of ways to do this. You can get a type of sugar cake to feed them. But I use this, and the way this works is I'll coat the bees down with it, just lightly spray them, and they'll clean themselves, and that gives them that honey, or that sugar in their system, like they were gorging on honey. So that's what we're going to be using mostly today to kind of calm the bees down once I get into the hive. Now, bees do something kind of interesting. Mandy mentioned the mason bees making like a mortar. Honeybees produce a glue to glue everything together in there called propolis. It's bee glue. And it is really tough stuff. They'll actually glue these boxes together, and you need a special tool called a hive tool. And I would bet that they have already started to glue everything together. So we're going to use this hive tool, and you also will need a brush to brush the bees off of surfaces you don't want them on. Say if I'm putting the box back on top and there are a lot of bees around the edge and I don't want to squash a lot of bees, I would need a brush. And you can buy these hive brushes that are really long and very soft to just kind of gently brush the bees and encourage them to fly away. I have a really soft bristled paintbrush that's never been used. It's only ever been my hive brush. It's a really soft, not a very stiff brush, and I can just kind of gently brush the bees away with this. And that also works as I'm unsuiting. I'll be honest, I get stung more often taking the suit off because of bees that are stuck to the suit and I don't realize it. So I try to brush them off the suit with this. Now we're going to get in there and we're going to take a look at what the bees are actually doing. These bees have not been disturbed for a few days. So hopefully there are some structures that we can take a look at together in this hive. And I'll try to kind of talk about what I'm doing as I'm doing it. I don't know how well you'll be able to hear me next to the hive, but we're going to give it a shot. Now, one other thing, I mentioned these are captured bees, and to capture a bee, it's really low tech. The bees will often swarm and suspend themselves off of a tree branch or something like that. And that was the case with these ones, as they were suspended off of a low-hanging shrub, a little red bud. And they will swarm in these big clusters, these big ball of bees. And there are these nice lightweight bee boxes. This is actually a box that you can buy from an apiary to capture feral swarms. And it really is as simple as opening up the lid, and you can snip off the branch and actually drop the whole thing in there. Or you can shake all of the bees into this box. You can close it up, and it's got a gate on one end that you can actually close so they can't escape. And it's pretty secure. I know it's really lightweight. It's made out of foam core, but really an essential thing to have. I was lucky that I just happened to have one. Someone had given one to me, and I never used it until this last week when I captured the swarm. So I'm going to put on my other glove and actually get out a frame to show you kind of what's going on inside the hive. Now, it's unfortunate, but when you get into the hive, you almost always kill a few bees. It happens pretty frequently. They get squished and things like that. So it's important that I at least try to I try not to mess with my hive unless I absolutely have to. I try not to get in there and disturb them too much unless it's actually necessary. Now, when it comes to like harvesting honey and things, you never want to take more honey you never want to take so much honey that they don't have a supply to last them through the winter. The happier and the more well-adjusted the bees are, the more honey you get at the end of the season. So I like to not contribute to their stress level too much, so I get a good yield of honey at the end of the year. So I'm going to go ahead and get started getting into this hive, and I'm gonna hit them with the smoker a couple of times just to kind of trigger their response a little bit, and then I'm going to switch over to just using the sugar water. All right. All right, so inside the smoker, you can use a lot of different fuels. I know a lot of beekeepers that like to use burlap or straw. You basically want it to just smolder in there, and the smoke has to be cool. You don't want it to be hot. I personally like cardboard egg cartons. They smolder nicely. So that's actually what I'm using today, is a cardboard egg carton. And I'm just gonna puff it in there a few more times. These gloves are really hard to hold on to things with. They're kind of like mittens. And then I'm gonna go ahead and get a frame out, and I'll bring it over and actually show you. All right, so this is a kind of a functioning frame. I don't know how well you can see it. They're pretty calm right now. I'm actually impressed. They were really unhappy the last time I got in there. I do not believe that the queen is in this frame. I thought maybe I would get lucky and find the one with the queen so I could point the queen out, but I do not think she is in here. These are all workers, all working really hard. And you can see, whoever asked about them being dangerous, I mean, I know I hit them with the sugar water and I put some smoke in there, but I mean, overall they're pretty calm. They're not trying to attack my hood or anything like that. They're not terribly upset. So this is what an active frame looks like, and what they're doing. I don't know if you can tell the lighter wax right here. That's all new foundation that they're laying. They're putting that new beeswax down and building cells. And again, if I put that queen excluder in there, those cells will either be used to store brood or honey. In that box, I would really like them to be used for honey. So, all right. So we're gonna put this back before they get too upset. If anybody has any questions, I can answer it as soon as I get back and take my gloves back off. But everybody got a good look at these bees.
Okay. So I don't know if Mandy, you might want to take this question or if we should wait for John, but how many honeybees live in a hive? Should we wait for John? Here, I have one other question that somebody asked that that I can ask in the meantime. Somebody asked, what was the book that you were referencing when you were speaking, Mandy? They want to know what a good book is to learn about bees.
So one of the books that when I first started learning my bees and wasps, we have these lovely books from Division of Wildlife. They do multiple field guides like these. They can be picked up at most of our state park nature centers will have them, as well as visitor centers and main offices may even carry them. And you can request copies through the Division of Wildlife education page, which right now is currently down, but hopefully we'll be back up soon. And then the other book that I used, this one is very scientific. It's not so scientific that you wouldn't be able to understand what it was saying, but bees, unfortunately, like our birds, do not have beautiful, pretty names for every species. So there is a lot of Latin in here, but it's just for the scientific names of each of the bees, not the whole book. So this is The Bees in Your Backyard by Joseph Wilson and Olivia Carroll.
So I'm going to put my email address in the Q&A section. So if anybody wants one of those field guides, they can also email me and I will, take their make sure that their information gets to the right place.
It's very easy to send them to people with their PDF that they offer on their websites. So it's great because field guides can get pretty heavy, but carrying these in a backpack is very light. Let's see if John knows that other answer.
All right, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are, John.
Okay, thank
Leslie,
you.
you're muted, though.
I can't see you very well with the shade on. So really quick, I'll try to get to the question. But really quickly, this here, when I was talking about feeding them sugar water, this is actually a feeder that is the same width and shape as a frame. It's a black hard plastic, and it's got these nice screens in them, so none of the bees drown. They can climb back out of the sugar water. So that's what I did just now, is filled this with more sugar water, and I'm putting the screens back in. I will reinstall this and get to your question.
Sorry, guys, I was muted again. So as soon as John answers this question, I'm going to wrap it up, but just want to thank all of you that joined us today. As I said, the last Ohio Protects Pollinator series or episode is going to be next week, Wednesday at 4. So hope to see you back then. And let's see. So John, are you able to quickly answer that? And then I want to wrap it up because we're at about an hour or so.
So there was a lot of buzzing going on. The question was about a book. What was a good resource?
Sorry, no. How many honeybees live in a hive?
Oh, thousands. like there can be 10,000 individuals in a really big functioning hive. And again, once they reach a certain mass, they might split and swarm, but there can be, I mean, that's part of the reason why when you buy bees, you're not buying 3,000 bees, you're buying 3 pounds, because there's so many of them all in one. You know, you're getting 3 pounds of bee. I mean, 10,000 individuals is not a stretch. That can be a big functioning colony, is 10,000 bees. So if you think about how many bees it might take to weigh 1 pound, that's a lot of bees. They don't weigh very much. You know, fractions of a gram a bee weighs. So there can be a ton of bees in one colony, which is sort of one of the reasons why when you're ordering bees commercially, they're by weight instead of saying I'm ordering 3,000 bees. You're ordering 3 pounds. So. All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Mandy. And thanks everybody that was watching. We did just get a comment from Christy who said, thank you. This was very informative. So I think that's a great note to end this on. So hope everybody enjoys the weather and gets outside today. It's beautiful out there. See you next time.
Thanks.